The Battle of Vella Lovella, fought on the night of October 6, 1943, stands as a critical but frequently overlooked naval engagement in the Solomon Islands campaign of World War II. While larger clashes, like the Battle of Guadalcanal, dominate popular history, this fierce night action represents a profound tactical and strategic turning point in the Pacific theater. It marked the definitive end of the Imperial Japanese Navy's system of using fast destroyers to resupply and evacuate isolated island garrisons, and demonstrated how an increasingly aggressive United States Navy shattered Japan's long-term plans for a coordinated strategic retreat. By late 1943, the structural balance of power in the Pacific had fundamentally shifted, forcing the Japanese High Command into desperate rearguard actions, while American forces honed the doctrine of island hopping to a razor-sharp edge. To understand the ferocity of the clash at Vella Lovella, one must examine the broader strategic landscape of the Solomon Islands in the autumn of 1943. Following their costly victory at Guadalcanal, Allied forces under Admiral William Halsey launched Operation Cartwheel, a massive, multi-pronged offensive designed to neutralize the major Japanese stronghold at Rabaul on New Britain. Rather than assaulting every heavily fortified Japanese position head-on, the Allies adopted a strategy of bypassing strongpoints, isolating them from resupply, and leaving them to wither on the vine. In the Central Solomons, this meant neutralizing the major Japanese airbase at Munda on New Georgia Island. After a brutal, grinding land campaign, American forces captured Munda in August 1943. This left the neighboring island of Columbang, where the Japanese had garrisoned over 10,000 troops at Vella, completely cut off. Instead of launching a bloody amphibious assault on Columbang, Halsey made the brilliant tactical decision to skip the island entirely. On August 15, 1943, Allied troops bypassed Columbangara and landed on Vella Lovella, an island further to the northwest. This maneuver effectively trapped the large Japanese garrison on Columbangara behind Allied lines, rendering them strategically useless. Realizing that Columbangara was now a liability and that Vella Lovella could be used as an Allied airbase to threaten Rabaul directly, the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters recognized that their position in the Central Solomons was untenable. They formulated a plan for a major strategic retreat, codenamed Operation Say, aiming to evacuate their stranded garrisons from Columbangara and Vella Lovella to reinforce more defensible positions in the northern Solomons. Specifically, Bougainville evacuation, however, was an incredibly hazardous proposition. The United States Navy and Army Air Forces completely dominated the daytime skies and waters around the Solomons. This forced the Japanese to rely entirely on night operations. For over a year, the Japanese had used their destroyer force as a makeshift transport fleet, running down the slot of the Solomon Islands under cover of darkness to drop off supplies or pick up troops before fleeing before dawn. But by October 1943, the United States Navy had grown adept at night fighting, utilizing radar to counter the superior night optics and visual training of the Japanese crews. The stage was set for a violent collision as Japan attempted to extract the final remnants of its forces from Vella Lovella. On the morning of October 6th, a Japanese evacuation force departed from Rabaul and the Shortland Islands. The force was split into two main components under the overall command of Rear Admiral Ijuin Matsuji. The combat section consisted of 6 modern destroyers: Akigumo, Isakaze, Kazagumo, Yugumo, Shigeru, and Samidare. Their mission was to screen and protect the transport section, which comprised a collection of subchasers, motor torpedo boats, and small landing craft tasked with embarking the roughly 600 Japanese soldiers remaining on Vella Lovella. Ijuin was a veteran commander, and his crews were highly trained in the deadly art of night torpedo attacks. Utilizing the devastating Type 93 long-lance torpedo, a weapon that possessed vastly superior range, speed, and explosive power compared to anything in the American inventory. As the Japanese force steamed southward, they were spotted by Allied reconnaissance aircraft. Word was quickly flashed to Captain Frank Walker, who commanded a small American destroyer force patrolling the area. Walker's immediate command, Destroyer Squadron 4, consisted of only 3 vessels: the USS Selfridge, USS Chevalier, and USS O'Bannon. Although Walker had 3 additional destroyers under his overall command, the USS Taylor, USS Ralph Talbot, and USS La Valette, they were currently positioned further to the south, escorting a convoy, and were too far away to join him immediately. Faced with reports of a significantly larger enemy fleet approaching, Walker made a bold, aggressive decision. Rather than waiting for his reinforcements to arrive and risking the Japanese successfully executing their evacuation, he chose to intercept the enemy immediately with just his 3 frontline ships. The two forces converged in the waters northwest of Vella Lovella just before midnight on October 6th. The night was dark, with a thin crescent moon offering minimal illumination, creating ideal conditions for a classic Pacific night surface action. At approximately 22 hours and 30 minutes, the American destroyers picked up the Japanese force on their surface search radar at a range of roughly 10 miles. Walker formed his 3 ships into a tight scouting column, with Selfridge leading, followed by Chevalier and O'Bannon. They accelerated to 30 knots, closing the distance rapidly. On the opposing side, Admiral Ijuin's force was somewhat disorganized, divided into 2 columns that were struggling to maintain visual contact with one another in the darkness. At 22 hours and 41 minutes, the battle commenced. The American destroyers, utilizing their superior radar-directed fire control, opened up with their 5-inch main batteries at a range of about 5,000 yards. The initial American salvos were remarkably accurate. Their target was the Japanese destroyer Yugumo, which had aggressively veered out of the Japanese formation to close the distance. Within minutes, 5-inch shells from Selfridge and Chevalier smashed into Yugumo, setting her superstructure ablaze, knocking out her steering gear, and leaving her dead in the water. However, the Japanese doctrine of night fighting relied heavily on rapid, overwhelming torpedo counterattacks. Even as Yugumo was being battered to pieces by American gunfire, her crew managed to launch a full spread of 8 long lance torpedoes into the darkness toward the flashing muzzle fires of the American ships. Simultaneously, the Japanese destroyers Shigeru and Samidare, positioned further out, also released a deadly salvo of torpedoes before turning away. The consequences for the American column were immediate and catastrophic. At 22 hours and 47 minutes, one of Ugamo's long lance torpedoes slammed into the port side of the USS Chevalier. The massive explosion ripped through her forward magazine, completely blowing off her bow up to the bridge infrastructure. The shockwave caused the ship to lose all power and steering, sending her into a wild, uncontrollable spin. The USS O'Bannon, steaming closely behind Chevalier in the tight column, was blinded by the smoke and fire. Before her crew could react or throw the engines into reverse, O'Bannon crashed violently into the stern of the crippled Chevalier. The two American destroyers became hopelessly entangled, their hulls grinding against each other as Japanese shells began to splash around them. Seeing his column shattered, Captain Walker on the flagship USS Selfridge pressed the attack alone, shifting his fire to the remaining Japanese destroyers, Isokaze and Kazugumo. For several minutes, Selfridge engaged multiple enemy ships in a desperate duel, but the Japanese torpedoes were still running through the water. Just 1 minute after Chevalier was hit, a long lance torpedo struck Selfridge on her starboard bow. The detonation was catastrophic, obliterating the forward section of the ship, killing dozens of crew members instantly, and threatening to break the destroyer in half. Like Chevalier, Selfridge was instantly knocked out of the offensive action. Her remaining crew, fighting frantically to shore up bulkheads and keep the vessel afloat. Walker's aggressive gamble appeared to have backfired disastrously. All three of his destroyers were heavily damaged or incapacitated. Ugamo was sinking, but Admiral Ujuin still possessed 5 fully operational, heavily armed destroyers. Had the Japanese commander pushed his advantage, he could have easily moved in to annihilate the crippled American ships and completely wipe out Walker's force. Yet, it was at this critical juncture that the psychological scars of previous naval encounters and the fog of war intervened to alter the course of the battle. Admiral Iduin, peering through the darkness, miscalculated the situation entirely. He saw the massive explosions on the American ships and observed the arrival of the 3 reinforcing American destroyers. The Taylor, Ralph Talbot, and Laval Lewich were finally closing in from the south. Ijuin incorrectly believed he was facing a much larger American fleet, possibly including cruisers. Fearful of losing more ships to what he perceived as an overwhelming force, and having already witnessed the brutal destruction of Iduin ordered his combat destroyers to turn north and retreat toward Rabaul. Iduin's retreat left the Japanese transport section to carry out the actual evacuation of the troops on Vella Lovella. While the destroyer battle had been raging, the smaller subchasers and landing craft had slipped into the bays of the island under cover of darkness. They successfully embarked the 600 stranded soldiers and slipped away completely undetected by the battered American forces. From a strictly tactical perspective, the Battle of Vella Lovella was a clear Japanese victory. They had successfully executed their mission of evacuating their troops, and they had inflicted severe damage on 3 American destroyers while losing only 1 of their own. However, viewing the Battle of Vella Lovella solely through the lens of tactical ship-for-ship losses misses its profound strategic significance. The battle was the final gasp of the Tokyo Express. It demonstrated to the Japanese high command that the cost of maintaining or even safely evacuating their positions in the Central Solomons had become prohibitively high. The loss of Yugamo, a valuable fleet destroyer, was a blow that the dwindling industrial capacity of Japan could ill afford to sustain. The United States, with its massive wartime manufacturing boom, could rapidly repair or replace damaged destroyers like Selfridge and O'Bannon. Japan could not replace its losses. Furthermore, the battle exposed deep structural flaws in Japan's overall strategy of a coordinated retreat. While Operation Sei succeeded in salvaging the men from Vella Lovella and Columbangara, those troops were evacuated without their heavy equipment, artillery, and supplies. They arrived in the northern Solomons as exhausted, poorly equipped infantry, unfit for immediate offensive operations. More importantly, by abandoning Vella Lovella, Japan handed the Allies a vital strategic platform. Within weeks of the battle, American Seabees had constructed a massive operational airfield on the island. From Vella Lovella, Allied fighters and bombers could launch short-range strikes against Bougainville, drastically accelerating the collapse of the entire Japanese defensive perimeter in the South Pacific. The engagement also highlighted a critical evolution in American naval leadership and doctrine. Captain Frank Walker's decision to attack a vastly superior force with only 3 destroyers was emblematic of a new, aggressive spirit within the United States Navy. Early in the war, American commanders had often been cautious and defensive during night actions, frequently falling victim to Japanese torpedo tactics. At Vella Lovella, despite being heavily outnumbered, the Americans did not hesitate to close the distance and strike first. This unyielding aggressiveness, coupled with the increasingly sophisticated use of radar, stripped the Japanese of their monopoly on night surface combat. The human cost of the battle was severe. The USS Chevalier was too badly damaged to be salvaged. After her surviving crew members were taken off by the O'Bannon, she was deliberately sunk by a torpedo from the USS La Valette to prevent her from falling into enemy hands or becoming a hazard to navigation. 54 American sailors went down with the Chevalier. The Selfridge suffered heavy casualties as well, losing 13 men, but her crew managed to sail the Bolus ship back to port for extensive repairs. The O'Bannon, despite her crumpled bow from the collision, survived and eventually returned to action. On the Japanese side, the sinking of Yugamo resulted in the loss of over 130 sailors, including her captain. Ultimately, the Battle of Vella Lovella was the closing chapter of the bloody campaign for the Central Solomons. It was a clash where tactical success for Japan could not mask a devastating strategic defeat. By attempting to manage a controlled retreat, the Japanese hoped to buy time to fortify their inner defensive ring. Instead, the relentless pressure applied by US destroyers turned that retreat into a costly, chaotic scramble. The American victory was not measured in the number of Japanese ships sunk that night, but in the total disruption of Japan's defensive architecture. After Vella Lovella, the Imperial Japanese Navy would never again attempt a major surface evacuation in the Solomons. The initiative had passed permanently to the United States, and the path to the definitive defeat of the Japanese Empire in the Pacific lay wide open.